I don't usually talk about the things I've seen out there. Most of the time, I've convinced myself that silence is the only way to keep them from feeling real. But lately, I've been waking up with that same feeling I had in the woods, like something is standing a little too close, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The strange part is, none of these trips were supposed to be memorable. They were meant to be quiet weekends outside the city, nothing more. Yet every time I went into the trees, something small happened first. Something I should have paid attention to. For one group, it was the way the forest went still all at once, as if the wind itself stepped back. For another, it was a stranger's face, too calm, too close, watching their campsite from the glow of the fire. And for the last one, it was a sound. Soft, careful, like someone repeating an old habit they never truly stopped. Those little details didn't seem important at the time, but now, when I look back, they were the first signs that none of them were alone out there. I still remember the sensation that pushed me to finally speak about this. It wasn't fear at first, it was a small physical reaction, like the way your chest tightens when someone whispers your name from behind. A pressure, a cold point between the shoulder blades. The sense that the darkness is no longer empty and that something patient is sharing the same air. And the images they described, they won't leave me. A circle of stones that hadn't been there an hour earlier, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. A notebook filled with lines someone carved one by one, night after night, waiting for the next tally. And above everything else, the quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, the kind that feels deliberate. The people who lived these stories were ordinary, not thrill seekers, not the type to invent ghosts in the trees. They went camping the same way most of us do, hoping for fresh air, a little distance, and the safety of a zipped tent and a nearby trail. But the woods don't care who you are. They only care how little anyone would hear if something went wrong. I think that's why these stories stay with me. Not because of what happened in each one, but because of the things that almost happened. The moments where a single choice, a single step, could have left nothing behind except a torn tent or a missing backpack. The moments where the forest felt like it was deciding whether to let them leave. And every time I go back over their words, I keep getting stuck on the same thought. If the smallest details were already wrong at the start, what was waiting further in? That's the part that unsettles me. Because in all three stories, the true terror didn't come from the wilderness itself. It came from whatever else was sharing it, moving at the edges of the firelight, circling a little closer each night, learning the rhythm of their breathing and the soft spots in their routines. And the worst part? All of them thought the same thing right before everything escalated. They thought they were finally safe, but that was only the beginning. The first story came from a guy who didn't sound like someone easily frightened. He spoke with that steady, measured tone people use when they're trying not to exaggerate, when they're trying to convince themselves that what they remember is exactly what happened, nothing more. He and 3 friends had gone camping deep in a state park, far enough in that the trail markers turned into old wooden slats nailed to trees. The forest there was tall and quiet, with pine needles thick enough on the ground to soften every step. They picked a clearing beside a sloping ridge, the kind of place where a campfire crackles a little louder because the wind stays trapped between the hills. At first, nothing about the night felt wrong. He remembers the smoke rising straight up, the smell of pine sap on their hands, the way the firelight skimmed across the bark, warm and harmless. But somewhere past midnight, something shifted. Not the temperature, not the wind, just the atmosphere. The forest felt like it exhaled and then held its breath. He was the first one to notice the silence. Every insect, every distant rustle, even the faint drip of moisture from the trees, it all stopped at once. Not faded, stopped. The kind of stillness you don't notice in real time, only in hindsight, when you realize you haven't heard anything for far too long. One of his friends, Devin, laughed and said it meant a deer was nearby, but the narrator wasn't so sure. He said it felt like something was paying attention to them. They went to sleep anyway, because that's what people do when they're trying to pretend nothing is wrong. You tell yourself you're tired, that the forest naturally shifts, that a little silence isn't a sign. You zip your tent and force your mind onto anything else. They split into 2 tents, he and Devin in one, the other 2 about 15 feet away. He remembers drifting in and out of sleep, the kind where you're not really resting, just floating under the surface, listening in case something cracks. And then the sound started, soft scraping, stone against stone, slow, deliberate, like someone grinding small rocks in their palm. He froze, breathing shallow, trying to make the noise fit something logical. Maybe the fire had collapsed. Maybe an animal was nudging around for scraps, but the rhythm was too careful, too practiced. A pause, a scrape, another pause, the same pattern again. He nudged Devin awake. Listen. They held still, and there it was, faint but unmistakable. Scrape, scrape. Devin whispered that it was probably the other two messing around, but the narrator said the direction was wrong. It wasn't coming from the other tents. It was coming from the tree line behind them, the side they hadn't cleared or checked before bed. He wanted to unzip the flap and look, but something in his chest locked up, like his body already understood something his mind didn't. Looking felt like the wrong move. Like whatever was out there was waiting for exactly that. The scraping continued for maybe another minute. Then nothing. Just that unnatural silence again. At some point, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe out of denial, they both drifted back to sleep. When the sun came up, the air felt normal again. Birds were calling, light was cutting through the trees. Everything looked so familiar that, for a moment, he wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. But then he crawled out of the tent. Their entire campsite had shifted. The tent he slept in had been rotated, an unmistakable, deliberate turn, maybe 60 degrees clockwise. The front flap no longer faced the dying campfire. It faced the woods, the dense part, the part that had been silent the night before. He shouted for the others, and the two friends in the second tent crawled out looking confused. Their tent hadn't been moved, only his. They tried to figure out if wind could have done it, but the stakes were still in the ground. They'd been pulled up and repressed into the dirt, one by one, at the new angle. None of the metal was bent, no prints in the soil, just careful repositioning. And then someone noticed the stones. Right behind the narrator's tent, maybe 3 feet from where his head had been, was a circle, perfectly formed. Palm-sized rocks arranged in a clean ring, each one touching the next. He swears it wasn't there the night before. They had cleared that area to set up. Nothing like it had been on the ground. The rocks themselves were smooth, some darker than others. A few had fresh scrapes across them, thin, sharp lines. He recognized the texture instantly. It was the same sound he had heard. Stone dragging across stone. One of his friends tried to laugh it off, but it came out wrong. Nervous, shaky. They checked for footprints, broken branches, anything. But the pine needles were thick, and whoever had done it moved with either precision or experience. The narrator got this tightening feeling in his throat, the kind that makes it hard to swallow. He realized that someone, or something, had been standing inches from the tent while they slept, close enough to hear their breathing, close enough to move around without disturbing a single twig. Devin kicked part of the stone circle apart, muttering that it was probably just a prank from hikers who'd passed through earlier. But something about the circle felt conscious, not playful, not random, purposeful. They packed up fast, faster than they ever had. The forest didn't feel like a place meant for them anymore. It felt like they'd stepped into something private, and whatever lived there had taken notice. When they reached the trailhead and looked back one last time, the narrator said something strange happened. The air behind the pines shimmered a little, just heat rising. Probably, but it gave him the sudden, irrational sense that something was watching them from just out of sight. He didn't tell the others. There was no reason to scare them more. But on the drive home, when everyone else fell asleep, he kept replaying it. The silence, the scraping, the perfect circle of stones, and that rotated tent facing the deeper part of the forest. What unsettled him most wasn't what had been done. It was the realization that whoever moved the tent had chosen his. The second story came from a woman whose voice never rose above a quiet, controlled calm. But every few sentences, there was a pause too long, too specific, as if she was seeing the memory instead of describing it. She and her boyfriend had taken a weekend camping trip, nothing ambitious. Just a short walk in sight with a picnic bench and a fire ring, wide enough that the trees left an opening for moonlight. They arrived late in the afternoon. The forest was warm, the air soft, nothing suggested danger. But the moment they stepped out of their car, she felt something like pressure in the atmosphere. Not fear, just the sense that someone else had been there recently. She noticed boot prints near the fire pit, fresh, deep. But they weren't alone on the trail, so she didn't think much of it. They pitched their tent, started a small fire, and ate dinner. It was one of those perfect evenings where smoke drifts lazily and the sky leans from blue to violet without you noticing. They spoke quietly, enjoying the kind of silence you only get miles from a road. Then they heard footsteps. Not heavy, not fast, just a slow approach from the left side of the clearing. A man stepped out of the trees holding a water bottle. Tall, mid-30s, short beard, eyes that didn't blink often. He smiled too quickly, like he was rehearsing it. He said his name was Aiden and that he'd set up camp, not far uphill. Her boyfriend tried to be polite, but she could tell something about the man unsettled him. Aiden didn't look dirty or tired like most hikers. He looked prepared. Clothes clean, boots polished, hair neat. He said he'd been out there a few nights already, but something about him felt wrong for someone living in the woods. He stood too close to the fire, watched their faces too carefully, answered questions in half sentences, as if weighing each word. She wanted him to leave almost immediately, but her boyfriend tried to keep the conversation friendly. Aiden talked about the trail conditions, how quiet the forest had been, how they should stay aware after dark. Then he said something strange. "If you hear movement up there, don't call out. They don't like noise." She asked who he meant. He just smiled again, small and stiff. "You'll know," he said. Her stomach tightened. Before either of them could ask more, Aiden turned and walked back into the trees without a goodbye. The way he moved bothered her, steady, confident, like he knew the path without needing light. They stayed awake longer than planned, both pretending to read or check gear. The forest was ordinary again, insects buzzing, an owl somewhere far off. But every now and then, she caught her boyfriend glancing toward the direction Aiden had gone, brows pinched. When they finally crawled into the tent, she couldn't relax. She lay listening to the night, waiting for some sign of what Aiden had hinted at. Hours passed. Nothing. Sometime around 2 a.m, she woke up without knowing why. No sound, no movement. Just an overwhelming sense that she had woken because something else was awake. She turned her head toward the mesh window. There was someone standing in the tree line. A silhouette. Still. Upright. Facing their tent. Too far to see a face, but close enough that she could tell it wasn't her imagination. Her breathing locked. She nudged her boyfriend until he stirred. He looked, froze, and whispered, "Is that him?" But before they could make sense of it, another shape stepped up beside the first, then a third. 3 figures, standing shoulder-width apart, watching. No flashlight, no movement, just standing. She reached for her phone to call for help, but her boyfriend shook his head and mouthed, "No noise." Aiden's words returned instantly. They don't like noise. They stayed like that for minutes that stretched far too long. She thought about unzipping the tent, running to the car, doing anything, but one of the silhouettes tilted its head slightly, as if listening. That tiny movement killed any courage they had left. At some point, the 3 figures drifted backward into the darkness, not turning, not stepping away, just fading, swallowed by the lack of moonlight. They waited until dawn before stepping outside, and that was when she realized something she hadn't noticed the night before. The second tent now stood up the hill, neat, centered, carefully pitched, exactly where Aiden said he was camping, but it hadn't been there before sunset. They would have seen it. They should have seen it. Her boyfriend suggested they walk up and check it out, but she grabbed his arm hard enough to leave marks. Everything in her body screamed that going closer was the wrong decision. Instead, they packed quickly, barely speaking, both listening for footsteps or voices. The forest was too calm. The silence felt thick, like there was weight behind it. Right before they left the clearing, she glanced back up the hill. The tent flap on Aiden's shelter moved. Not from wind, not from an animal. A hand slid out pale, narrow fingers and pressed lightly on the fabric from the inside, as if feeling the air. She didn't scream, didn't speak. She simply turned and walked to the car with a pace that bordered on frantic. They never saw Aiden again. No one matched his description at the ranger station, and no long-term permits had been issued for that part of the park that week. But the part that still troubles her months later is this. When she replayed the moment with the 3 silhouettes, the spacing of their shoulders, their height differences, the angles of their heads, none of them matched Aiden's build. Whoever those figures were that watched their tent, he wasn't one of them. The last story didn't come from a group or a couple. It came from a man who preferred to hike alone, the kind of person who feels more comfortable with trees than with small talk. He wasn't dramatic when he told it. If anything, he sounded annoyed with himself, like he'd ignored his own instincts for longer than he should have. He'd gone out for a simple overnight trip, 1 backpack, 1 tent, a loop trail with a few side paths that weren't officially maintained anymore. He liked those parts best, the sections where the markers thinned out and the forest started to feel older. By late afternoon, he'd followed one of those side paths into a shallow valley. The air there felt heavier, like it held on to the day's warmth longer than it should. He found a small clearing with a rotting fire ring, half buried under leaves. It looked like no one had used it in years. He was wrong. As he dropped his pack, he saw it a shape slumped near the edge of the clearing. A tent, old, discolored, sagging under its own weight. The fabric was stained green and brown, seams splitting, mesh eaten away by time. He called out once, a simple hello, just to make sure. No answer. The tent didn't move. There was no gear around it, no chairs, no coolers, no sign that anyone had left in a hurry, just that old, collapsed shelter. He should have turned around then. That's what he tells himself now. But curiosity is a quiet kind of gravity. It pulls you a step at a time until you're standing too close. He approached from the side and nudged the fabric with his boot. It was damp and soft, like touching skin that's been underwater too long. A sour, moldy smell leaked out, mixed with something metallic underneath. Faint but sharp enough to sting the back of his throat. He unzipped the front halfway and lifted the flap. Inside, there was no sleeping bag, no clothes, no personal items, just an old notebook lying in the dirt, its cover warped and swollen. He hesitated before reaching in. The air inside the tent was colder than outside, even with the sun still up. His fingers brushed the paper, and for a second he thought he heard something, the quick patter of footsteps somewhere behind him. When he turned, the clearing was empty. He told himself it was an animal and pulled the notebook out. Every page he flipped through was the same. No dates, no words, just lines. Dozens of them. Horizontal strokes scratched in tight clusters, grouped by fives. 4 vertical, 1 slash through, over and over. Tally marks. Someone counting something they didn't bother to label. Near the back, the marks grew shaky, uneven, pressed deeper into the paper, as if whoever drew them had been gripping the pen too tightly. The last page wasn't full. It stopped in the middle of a set. 3 lines. Then nothing. He stood there longer than he wants to admit, staring at those 3 abandoned marks. He felt an irrational urge to finish the set, to complete the pattern. His hand even twitched once. He closed the notebook and forced it back down. That should have been the end of it. Leave the tent, walk away, camp somewhere else. Instead, he told himself it was just an old campsite, maybe some kid's weird way of passing time. He set up his own tent on the opposite side of the clearing, far enough away that he wouldn't have to see the collapsed shelter when he stepped out, but he could still feel it there like a weight at the corner of his vision. As night came down, the forest around him grew dim. The sky should have been clear. He remembered seeing stars when he first lit his stove, but under the trees, the darkness thickened faster than it should have. He cooked, ate, and cleaned in near silence. Every now and then, he'd glance toward the spot where the old tent slumped in shadow. He couldn't see it, but he knew exactly where it was. After a while, even the normal sounds seemed to thin out. Crickets grew faint. The wind lost its edge. The crackle of his fire felt distant, as if the flames were trying not to draw attention. He banked the fire, zipped himself into his tent, and lay down. His body was tired. His mind refused to follow. He drifted in that thin space between waking and sleep, listening. That's when he heard the first whisper. It wasn't a word, more like breath dragged across syllables, too soft to decipher. It came from somewhere outside, low to the ground. He thought maybe it was the wind at first, air slipping through branches. Then it repeated, closer, a murmur, a hush, the cadence of someone counting under their breath. His chest tightened. The old notebook flashed in his mind. All those tally marks, all those unfinished sets. He held his breath without meaning to. The whispering stopped. Silence pressed in around the tent. He could hear his own pulse in his ears. Then, something scraped very softly against the side of his tent. Not claws, not a branch. Knuckles, maybe. Or nails. Moving slowly downward, like someone dragging their hand along the fabric just to see where it ended. He stayed completely still. He didn't call out. He didn't cough or shift or do anything to let whatever was outside know he was awake. The scraping moved once more, then stopped near his head. He could feel it now, not physically, but in that way you sense when someone is inches away on the other side of a thin wall. A presence, focused, waiting. The whisper began again. This time, it was clear enough that he caught the pattern. Numbers, not full sentences, just a faint, deliberate rhythm. 1, 2, 3, over and over. always stopping before 5, starting again. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to think of normal things. It didn't help. The counting went on, low and patient, until the sound blurred into the background of his thoughts. At some point, exhaustion must have forced him under. He doesn't remember falling asleep, just the sudden awareness of light pressing through the tent fabric when he opened his eyes. Morning. The forest sounded normal again. Birds, insects, wind. He unzipped the tent and stepped out. The old shelter on the far side of the clearing looked the same. Rotting, sunken, unmoved. But the notebook was no longer where he'd left it outside the flap. It was sitting upright in front of his own tent. The cover was open to the last page. The 3 incomplete tally lines he remembered were now 5. Someone had finished the set. He didn't touch the notebook, didn't flip back through the pages. He just stared at those added marks, 2 strokes that hadn't been there the day before, until his vision started to swim. Something else caught his eye then. Hanging from a low branch at the edge of the clearing was a small shape. At first, he thought it was trash, maybe a plastic bag caught on the wood. Then he stepped closer. It was a squirrel, dead, limbs limp, neck twisted at an unnatural angle. A piece of thin cord kept it dangling from the branch. Its fur was matted, but its eyes were open, glassy, and fixed in the direction of his tent. He didn't pack slowly. He didn't check the fire ring twice. He shoved everything into his backpack and left the clearing without looking back. On the hike out, he kept hearing faint echoes of that whisper whenever the wind passed through the trees. Short strings of numbers forming and dissolving before his mind could pin them down. He never went camping alone again. And sometimes, on nights when his apartment is too quiet and the clock in the hallway ticks a little too loud, he catches himself counting without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, and stopping before 5. I think what unsettles me most about these stories isn't the obvious danger in them. It's how normal everything felt right before things went wrong. None of them walked into the woods expecting fear. They brought snacks, cheap flashlights, borrowed gear. They joked about bugs and bad coffee, not circles of stone or strangers who stand too still. But listen to the details they nearly left out. The campsite turned a few degrees off its original angle. Boot prints that didn't quite match the number of people nearby. A tent left to rot around a notebook no one claimed. Those things don't come with explanations. They just sit there in the memory like splinters. What stays with me is how the forest seemed to react to them. The way the air thinned around the first group, as if sound itself was being held back. The way 3 figures appeared for the couple, only after they were told not to call out. The way the numbers at that last campsite quietly advanced. Even though no one remembers picking up a pen, there's a pattern under all 3 nights. If you line them up, none of them were truly alone, and none of them realized it until it was almost too late. Someone stepped close enough to move a tent without waking the people inside. Someone watched a couple breathe in their sleep from the edge of the tree line and chose not to cross that invisible line. Someone spent long, unbroken hours under a sagging shelter, counting something in the dark until their hand couldn't keep the rhythm steady anymore. And whoever they were patient. That's the part that rattles me. We're used to thinking about danger as sudden as a shout, a snapped branch, a violent burst of movement. But what if most of the time, it isn't like that at all? What if real danger is quiet? What if it stands completely still, watching you build your fire, learning the sound of your footsteps, the way you turn in your sleep, the exact breath you take before you ignore your instincts and close your eyes? Think about when each of them felt safest. The friends zipped themselves in after a long night of laughing. The couple lay down after convincing themselves they were overreacting to a strange man's warning. The solo camper told himself an old tent and a notebook were just trash left behind. Those were the moments when something just outside the firelight decided to move closer. I can't stop wondering how many nights like that go unnoticed. How many times a hiker never sees the extra set of prints, never catches the silhouette at the edge of the clearing, never finds the notebook or the dead animal left hanging just high enough to be almost missed. Maybe you felt it too. Maybe you were camping with friends, or sitting under a line of trees, and for no clear reason the conversation slowed. The hair on your arms rose. You became aware of how small the circle of light around you really was. And for a second, you had the quiet certainty that if you looked into the dark for too long, something would be looking back. Maybe you laughed it off, called it imagination, or the way the brain fills in the empty spaces. That's what they all tried to do. The guy with the stone circle pretended the scraping was nothing. The woman with the watching figures tried to treat Aiden like any other camper. The man with the tally marks told himself curiosity was harmless, as long as he left everything where he found it. But forests have their own kind of memory. They absorb routines, the path someone walks, the spot they stand to watch, the rhythm of numbers whispered under their breath. Sometimes, if you walk through those places at the wrong time, you brush against something that was already there long before you, something that hasn't quite finished what it started. So the next time you're out in the woods, and the wind dies a little too fast, or the night feels one shade heavier than it should, don't rush past that feeling. Pay attention to the way your tent faces. Pay attention to any shape that lingers between the trunks. Pay attention to anything that looks like a pattern someone began and never got the chance or the courage to complete. And if you ever wake up with the sense that you weren't the only one counting your breaths in the dark, just remember, some circles don't break, some watchers don't leave, and some tallies are finished by hands you never see.